I first realized something was wrong not by the phone call, not by a knock at the door, but by a chair. It was the chair she always sat in, pulled slightly away from the table, as if someone had just stood up. The cushion, worn and patterned in faded orange and brown, looked untouched, yet the subtle tilt of the legs betrayed a presence. On the table, her teacup sat cold, the surface of the liquid still unbroken by dust, as though it had been abandoned mid-thought. That was the first clue, the silent herald that everything had changed. I had never seen a house so filled with absence before, so filled with expectation, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to understand what I could not yet name. Grandmother's house had always been a place of quiet gravity. It was not grand, nor decorated with ostentation, but the walls held stories in a language I had never learned to speak. Every room had a smell, old wood, faint perfume, and the persistent undertone of herbs that she claimed could cure anything from a cold to heartbreak. The living room carpet had the pattern of centuries, threads so thin that they felt like the whispers of long-forgotten conversations. I had taken it all for granted for years, never thinking that the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, or the muted sunlight through the curtains might someday carry a weight I could not lift. I was late. That was the first sharp, jarring thought. The house was silent in a way that made silence itself feel like a presence, as though the walls were watching and judging. She had always been there, always a constant. The thought that she could be gone, that a moment existed without her, was inconceivable. And yet the chair, the cup, the muted air spoke differently. I remembered her hands first. They had always seemed ordinary to me, the hands of a grandmother who gardened, cooked, and mended socks. But looking at the ones that lay folded on the armrest of her chair, I suddenly noticed everything. The veins like ancient rivers, the knuckles thick with years, the faint scars of small injuries, all tracing a life I had only ever observed in fragments. Those hands, so familiar, seemed impossibly fragile. They carried the weight of decades without complaint, had held me, my parents, perhaps even the weight of their own secrets. They had never demanded attention, never claimed importance, and yet now they screamed it in silence. I wandered the house as if searching for her, opening doors slowly, stepping softly, as though noise could shatter what remained. The kitchen was unchanged, a shrine of normalcy. The faded linoleum floor, the jars of preserves, the little teapot she always left on the stove. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet I knew that every object, every corner, was now a ghost of memory, a trace of someone I could no longer speak to. Her presence had always been quiet, almost invisible, but it was absolute. She had a way of existing in a room that made absence feel impossible, that made life feel anchored. It was only now, facing the aftermath of her leaving, that I realized how deeply she had defined the space around her. The house was hers in a way that went beyond ownership, a kind of gravitational field shaped by routine, care, and history. And the silence now was not peace, it was accusation. I sat in her chair eventually, not wanting to yet leave, not wanting to yet acknowledge the truth. The cushion sagged under me, familiar yet alien. I could almost feel her weight beside me, the warmth that had been there every evening, every visit, every shared meal. I remembered the long afternoons of her humming, the way she knitted silently while we watched the clouds pass, the quiet way she knew things without ever saying them. These were conversations, if one could call them that, less words, more presence, more understanding. I realized then that I had taken all of it for granted. She had never needed to teach directly. Life lessons were embedded in the rhythm of her days. I had learned patience by watching her wait, resilience by watching her endure small, quiet hardships without complaint, generosity by observing her give her last without hesitation. Now, the absence of these lessons felt tangible, a physical weight pressing down in the room. I had ignored the simplicity of her wisdom, assuming I had time. Time, I discovered, was not guaranteed. Later, I found myself in her bedroom. The air smelled of lavender and dust, a peculiar, comforting mixture. Her bed was neatly made, the covers tucked just so, pillows arranged with the meticulous care she had always shown. On the nightstand, a small lamp, its shade embroidered with faded flowers, cast a warm, dim light across the room. And there it was again, the strange, unsettling quiet that seemed to speak louder than any words could. I thought about the last conversation we had, or, more accurately, the last conversation that should have happened. We had shared so many words over the years, stories, advice, quiet acknowledgments, but somehow, when it came to the moment that mattered, I had no words prepared. I was always too busy, too distracted, too certain of another tomorrow. But she had always understood. I could see it now in the way she had looked at me that last evening, the faint smile that hinted at unspoken messages, the way her eyes held mine longer than usual. That had been the conversation. It had been everything. And I had missed it. I spent hours that day moving slowly through her home, touching objects she had touched, inhaling scents she had inhaled, listening to the silence she had created. Each room was a testament to a life well lived, carefully constructed without the need for grandeur. The hours stretched, blending past and present, until it felt as if time itself had paused in mourning. And all the while, the chair remained empty, a mute witness to my grief, a symbol of opportunity lost. It was in that quiet, wandering state that I began to piece together fragments of her life I had never truly seen. Old photographs, tucked into drawers, revealed a woman I did not know. Youthful, defiant, smiling with a vitality I had never imagined. Letters, neatly folded, hinted at friendships and loves, secrets held close and never shared. Her existence was far broader, richer, more complex than the comforting, familiar grandmother I had always known. And yet, despite all I did not know, I could feel the consistency of who she was, the unbroken thread that connected her younger self to the presence that had shaped my world. The first part of understanding her absence was realizing that she had always known how to leave. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, but quietly, deliberately, with dignity and foresight. In her papers, I found instructions, small gestures prepared for the inevitable. She had thought about this moment more carefully than I had thought about a single day of my life. It was not just foresight. It was a final lesson, a subtle, unspoken message about the weight of time, the inevitability of endings, and the importance of presence. Sitting there, alone in the dim light of her bedroom, I felt a mixture of emotions I could not untangle. Sorrow, regret, admiration, and a creeping cold fear of my own impermanence. She had passed without fanfare, without warning, and yet in a way she had orchestrated her absence to speak louder than any words ever could. I had not known that conversations could be held without sound, without interaction, yet I felt that hers had been absolute, final, and incomprehensibly complete. Evening came, and the shadows stretched across the room, painting long, unfamiliar shapes on the walls. I lit a candle, as she might have done, and placed it on the nightstand. The flame flickered, casting brief, dancing light over her belongings, illuminating the traces of a life that was at once ordinary and extraordinary. I realized that in all the hours I had spent avoiding the gravity of the real, she had been preparing me for this moment, silently, invisibly. And in that realization, I understood the depth of my failure to truly be present. I left the bedroom reluctantly, carrying with me a sense of unfinished business. But the house, now alive with echoes of her existence, seemed to guide me, urging me to notice, to reflect, to remember. In the hallway, the photographs on the wall caught the last rays of daylight, faces smiling, laughing, living. And I began to understand that the last conversation was not a single moment, a single phrase, but the accumulation of decades, small acts, subtle signals, and enduring presence. It was a dialogue that had taken place over years, and I had been too blind to recognize it until it was irrevocably concluded. The next morning, the sun rose pale and uncertain, as though it too hesitated to illuminate a world without her. I wandered the house again, moving through rooms with careful steps, feeling the weight of absence press on me in ways I could not articulate. In the kitchen, the teacup remained untouched, the faint ring it left on the table a stubborn reminder of what had been lost. I poured myself a cup of coffee, but it was tasteless, irrelevant. Nothing could fill the space she had left behind. I opened drawers and cabinets, tracing her routines in absent-minded fascination. There were spices she always measured by instinct, not by recipe. Bowls stacked precisely in the cupboard. Towels folded with the exact crease along the edge. Every object, every movement she had made over decades seemed imbued with meaning now. I realized, painfully, that I had never truly watched her work, not closely, not with attention. And in that realization, the depth of my negligence struck me with a physical ache. Then I found it, a small, unassuming box tucked behind the books on the shelf in the living room. It was unremarkable, wooden and plain, with a simple latch that clicked softly when opened. Inside were photographs, letters, and a single envelope, heavy with the weight of careful deliberation. The photographs were of people I did not know, friends, lovers, colleagues, faces smiling, laughing, living lives I had never imagined she had lived. And in those images, I saw her in ways that shattered my previous understanding. Defiant, youthful, radiant, fearless. She had been more than the grandmother I thought I knew. She had been a force in her own right, a presence that the world had shaped and which she had shaped in return. The letters were folded with precision, written in her familiar, looping script. Some were old, brittle with age, others more recent, but all carried a weight I could feel without reading. And then there was the envelope, marked with my name in careful handwriting. I hesitated before opening it, aware that doing so would cross a threshold from which there was no return. When I finally broke the seal, I found a single sheet of paper inside. Not a letter, not a confession, not a farewell in words, but a message written in the language of her life. It read, "I have prepared everything. You will see it when you are ready. Some conversations are not for words. Some lessons are only learned in absence. Remember this: presence is more than being here. It is attention, care, love. You will understand one day. Her message struck me with a force I could not resist. It was at once a comfort and an indictment. She had orchestrated her absence to teach me, to confront me with the truth I had ignored for too long. And yet, the brilliance of it made me furious. How dare she leave me like this? How dare she make me feel both gratitude and guilt simultaneously? I had spent my life assuming she would always be there, a constant, unmovable. And now she had left, and with her departure, she had left me alone with the enormity of my failures. I spent the rest of the morning moving slowly through her home, touching objects, opening drawers, noticing details I had never noticed before. Every photograph, every trinket, every piece of furniture became a vessel of memory, a fragment of a conversation that had been silent, yet pervasive. I began to understand that her life had been a series of conversations without words, dialogues enacted through presence, attention, and care. And the absence of these dialogues now left me deaf to the ordinary rhythms of life. By afternoon, I had begun to sort through the box of papers more systematically. The letters revealed a side of her I had never imagined. She had been loved. She had loved fiercely. She had made choices that required courage I had never credited her with. There were documents indicating her involvement in causes I had never suspected. Photos of her standing proudly with friends in moments of defiance and strength. She had been more than a grandmother. She had been a life fully lived, a force that had shaped not only my world, but the worlds of countless others. And then I found the notebook. It was small, leather-bound, and filled with her handwriting. The pages were dense with observations, reflections, and instructions. Some were practical, reminders to pay bills, notes about appointments, things I now realized she had organized to protect me from worry. Others were philosophical, musings on life, death, and the quiet power of ordinary acts. The final pages were the most striking. A series of reflections on mortality, on endings, on the importance of presence. She had written as if she knew exactly when she would leave, and she had prepared herself and me for that inevitability. The revelation was both astonishing and horrifying. I had assumed she would live forever, that her presence was a guarantee, a constant that required no attention. But the truth was far more complex. She had lived with full awareness of her own mortality, and in that awareness, she had orchestrated her life and her death with precision. The final conversation, the one I had missed, had not been lost. It had happened across years, in the accumulation of her actions, her care, her attention. I had simply been too blind to notice. Evening fell, and the house took on a different character. Shadows stretched long across the floor, painting the familiar objects with an unfamiliar weight. I lit another candle, placing it on the windowsill where she had often sat, looking out at the garden she loved. The flame flickered in the gentle evening breeze, casting shifting patterns across the walls. I realized that the house was not empty. It was charged with her presence, alive with the echoes of her life. And yet, it was also a space of confrontation. The lesson she had left me was impossible to ignore, and I could not escape the mixture of admiration, grief, and anger it evoked. I thought about the moments I had wasted, the days I had ignored, the opportunities I had missed to truly be present with her. She had given me countless chances to understand, to connect, to converse in the silent, profound language she had always used. And I had failed. The realization was a physical ache, a hollowing out that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. I returned to the living room, sitting in her chair once more. The weight of absence pressed down on me, yet there was also a strange comfort in it. She had left not in chaos, not in suddenness, but with deliberate intention. Her life had been a conversation with the world, and now her departure was another layer of dialogue, a final lesson I could not evade. I closed my eyes, imagining her presence beside me, hearing the unspoken words that had always been there. And in that imagining, I understood that the last conversation had taken place not in the moments I had witnessed, but in the space between words, in the attention she had always given, and in the absence she now used to teach me. The night deepened, and I wandered through the garden she had tended so carefully. The flowers were past their prime, yet still held the memory of blooms long gone. I touched the petals, the soil, the leaves, feeling the continuity of her care. Every plant, every stone, every corner of the garden was infused with her presence, and I realized that she had communicated through these things more clearly than through any words. She had spoken in silence, and in that silence lay the fullness of her love, her attention, and her guidance. And yet, the anger remained. How could she have left me so unprepared for the enormity of her absence? How could she have conveyed such profound truths without the clarity of words? I wanted to shout, to demand answers, to confront the finality she had orchestrated. But the house, the garden, the shadows, all were silent witnesses. The conversation had already occurred, and it was complete. I was left to reckon with it on my own. As I sat there, the candle flickering, the night deep around me, I realized that the lesson was not about her. It was about me. She had prepared everything, arranged everything, left me with a final challenge: to see, to understand, to live with awareness. The absence was not punishment, but a mirror. And the reflection it offered was unflinching. I could no longer ignore the depth of my own inattention, the ease with which I had taken presence for granted. By midnight, exhaustion weighed on me, and yet I could not sleep. I returned to her chair inside the house, the familiar cushion now heavy with memory. I imagined her beside me, silent but attentive, and felt the weight of the final conversation settle around me. It was a dialogue of years, of presence, of care, and it demanded acknowledgement. I realized then that understanding her life required more than observation. It required a willingness to confront my own failures, to face the consequences of absence, and to accept that some conversations happen not with words, but with time, attention, and love. The following morning, I awoke with a strange sense of determination. The house seemed different in the light of day, not empty, but charged, alive with traces of her life, her choices, her absent presence. I moved slowly through the rooms again, tracing the pattern she had left behind, the way the curtains fell, the careful arrangement of books, the folds of the blankets on her bed. Everything she had touched carried meaning I had never appreciated. And now, confronted with the full scope of her deliberate attention, I felt both awe and despair. I returned to the box I had found the day before. The photographs, the letters, and notebook lay in neat piles. I picked up one of the letters, The ink faded, but still legible. It was addressed to no one, yet it spoke to me more clearly than anything she had ever said aloud. Some lessons are not for words. Some truths are revealed only in absence. You will see, in time, how presence can be more powerful than speech. I read it again and again, feeling the weight of every letter. The brilliance of it was infuriating. How could she teach me so much without ever saying a word? And yet, I knew it was the ultimate gift, a conversation that transcended time, that demanded reflection, that required the silent attention I had too often neglected. I spent hours that day walking through the neighborhood she had loved, retracing the paths she had taken in her youth, the shops she had visited, the streets she had known intimately. I realized that her life had been a series of silent conversations, not only with me, but with the world around her. Every act of kindness, every gesture, every small habit had been deliberate, intentional, meaningful. She had left behind more than memories. She had left behind evidence of a life lived with absolute awareness. By evening, I returned to her home, exhausted but restless. I wandered the garden again, feeling the soil between my fingers, inhaling the faint scent of herbs she had cultivated. The shadows lengthened, and the last light of the sun glinting on the edges of flowers and leaves. I felt her presence everywhere, in the tilting branches of the trees, in the stillness of the pond, in the air itself. And yet, the absence remained. It was a paradox. She was everywhere, and nowhere. It was then that I found the final piece of her preparation. Beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, carefully hidden, was a small envelope addressed to me in her handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a key, small and unremarkable, with a note attached. The last conversation awaits. Use this wisely. My heart pounded as I looked at the key. What could it unlock? The questions raced through my mind, unrelenting, but there was only one way to find out. I followed the instructions she had scrawled in her notebook, moving carefully through the house until I reached a small, forgotten door at the back of the basement. The lock clicked easily under the key, and the door swung open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I hesitated, feeling the weight of anticipation and fear, then stepped inside. The air was cool, damp, heavy with the scent of earth and wood. Each step echoed in the silence, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a small room, bare except for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat an envelope, identical to the one I had just used. My name was written on it. I approached, my hands trembling, and opened it. Inside was a sheet of paper, written in her precise, looping script. The final conversation is not what you expect. It is not a conversation at all. It is a mirror. Look carefully, and you will see yourself. Confused, I looked around the room. There were no mirrors, no objects, nothing to reflect me but the chair itself. And then I realized, the conversation was not literal. It was a challenge, a confrontation with my own failures, my own absence, my own inability to recognize the quiet power of presence. The room demanded that I see myself clearly, without distraction, without deflection, without excuse. I was alone, yet completely seen. Hours passed as I sat there, grappling with the weight of her message. I saw every moment I had taken for granted, every opportunity I had ignored,
every failure to pay attention, every refusal to truly be present. I saw the ways I had hidden behind routine, behind distraction, behind comfort, and the vast, unbridgeable distance it had created between us. And I felt rage, not at her, but at myself, at the time I had wasted, at the words I had left unsaid. And then, something unexpected happened.
A drawer in the corner of the room, previously unnoticed, slid open with a soft creak. Inside was a small music box, delicate and ornate. I lifted it, turning the key, and a haunting melody filled the room. It was a song I had never heard, yet somehow knew, as though it had been embedded in my memory. And then I understood. The music was the last part of her conversation. It was an expression of everything she had felt, everything she had known, everything she had prepared for me. And in that moment, I wept, not just for her, and not just for myself, but for the profundity of a life that had spoken without words, that had taught without instruction, and that had loved without explanation. But the revelation was not yet complete. As the music played, I noticed a small note tucked beneath the base of the music box. Now you know, and now you understand. Remember this. Life is finite. Attention is fleeting. Presence is a gift. Guard it carefully. Do not waste it as I have allowed you to waste mine. The words struck me like a thunderclap. She had orchestrated not only her departure, but my reckoning. The final conversation was not a dialogue. It was an awakening, a confrontation, a challenge that I could neither evade nor refuse. I left the basement, the keys still in my hand, the music box tucked under my arm. The house felt transformed. Every shadow, every corner, every object now carried layers of meaning I had never noticed before. I realized that she had left me a legacy far beyond memory or inheritance. She had left me understanding, the ability to see, to reflect, to confront the truth of presence and absence, and life and death. And yet, in that understanding, then there was anger, and not at her, but at the cruelty of clarity, and at the sharpness of loss, and at the inevitability of mortality. That night, I sat in her chair one final time. The candle flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. I imagined her beside me, silent but fully present, and I understood that the last conversation had taken place not in words, but across decades of attention, care, and subtle communication. She had spoken to me in the language of life itself, and now it was up to me to respond. The unpredictability of it all, the revelation of hidden depths, the orchestration of absence, and the final confrontation with myself left me reeling. I felt emotions I could not name: grief, admiration, guilt, awe, fury. It was a mixture that refused to settle, that demanded attention, and that refused consolation. She had given me everything, and in doing so, had left me with nothing but the truth. And so I understood, finally, the paradox she had created. The last conversation was not a conversation at all. It was a mirror, a challenge, a gift, and a reckoning. It was something that could not be prepared for, predicted, or fully comprehended. And as I sat there, in the quiet of her home, in the shadows of her absence, I realized that this was the most profound lesson she could have given. I would never forget it. Not because it was comforting, not because it was complete, but because it was real, because it was hers, because it had changed me forever.